like to introduce Dr. Gary LaFree from the University of Maryland. Dr. LaFree is a career criminologist and is the director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. START is easier to remember on that. If you actually Google Dr. Gary LaFree, you'll see tons of journal articles, everything from domestic terrorism to radicalization of gangs to terrorism. And his research is just huge on that, but not only at a national level, but at an international level. He's going to actually spend some time in the summer overseas doing very similar work with this. So with that, Dr. Gary LaFree, when we asked him if he'd come out and do this, he was very more than happy, very gracious in doing so. Thank you, sir. And so what I explained is we're looking at two different sections, and these are some topics that we're interested in. And so, Dr. LaFree. Thank you.
When I first heard the introduction, Vic said he's a career criminologist. I'm glad he didn't say he's a career criminal. That would have been not the best introduction. So I want to thank Vic for the invitation, and actually it's great to be back in the Southwest. I worked for 20 years at the University of New Mexico. My wife is from Las Cruces, and my sister-in-law and her son are here from El Paso today. They live here in this area, so it's always good to get back to this area. What I wanted to do today, we have two sections. I think in the materials you received, I actually have them in reverse order, but they're linked in a way. Both of these sections are based on what some people in the business call open source data. So essentially what you can get in the unclassified world as it relates to terrorism, radicalization, political extremism, and so on. So I'm going to start out with a sort of broader set of data first, which is essentially a database called the Global Terrorism Database, where we try to pick up information on every single terrorist attack anywhere on the planet. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that, what the procedures are. And I'm going to end by giving you, we have a really nifty training session on this. And if you're interested in digging down a bit deeper and perhaps wanting to do some of your own analysis, I'll give you some information about how you can do that. It's online. It's about $30, I think, to do the training session. But it'll allow you to do reports and compare pretty much anything you want to do with regard to characteristics of terrorism, both here, abroad, anywhere on the planet. So I'll get to both of those. I also want to just say a quick word. Let's see if this is, where do I aim this? As Vic noted in his introduction, I direct a center called the START Center. It was funded originally by the Department of Homeland Security back in 2004. And in general, they've funded about 12 of these centers now over the years. We are the ones that deal most directly with the behavior and social sciences. So our mission has been to look at the human causes and consequences of terrorism since the time we began. Really what we've tried to do is build a science of terrorism, and both the presentations I'm going to be talking about today speak to that. I don't know exactly why this is the case, but back before 9/11, I think it's fair to say that there really wasn't much in the area of terrorism studies at that point in the United States or elsewhere. Criminology, I don't know how many of you, probably some of you have criminology background, that's my background. It did not have a big space with regard to terrorism. Political science, you think, would study terrorism, they really didn't do much. And psychology also didn't do much. So our overarching goal, and I hope it sort of comes through my two presentations, is to try to move us to treating terrorism like we treat other things we're interested in studying, like crime or suicide or dental hygiene, for that matter. So essentially treating it just like any other kind of problem that can be studied. And hopefully by studying, understand our adversaries better, understand the threat environment we're in better, and so on. I'm basing a bunch of this stuff on a book that just came out with Margaret Crenshaw called Countering Terrorism, which is published by Brookings Institute Press. And you'll see a lot of what we're going to be talking about today and this afternoon as well is the difficulty of actually getting good data and trying to get good data out to people like yourselves who are actually on the front line dealing with this problem. So a lot of the issues we'll be talking about deal with that nature. Now the talk today, the flashy title I have is Black Swan versus Burstiness. So I probably should start out, since you're being tested on this as well, I should start out by explaining what we mean by both of them. A black swan is basically a reference to an essay. Have any of you heard this before, Black Swan? Some of you have, good. So it goes back to an essayist named Nassim Taleb. And he defines a black swan as an incident that falls outside the realm of regular expectation, has a high impact, and defies prediction. And he uses the term based on the observation that before they visited Australia, Europeans had assumed that all swans were white because there was no such thing as a black swan anywhere else in the world except Australia. And this was supported by their own experience, but it was eventually called into question. Taleb claims that the coordinated attacks of 9/11 are a perfect example of a black swan incident because they were unexpected, they had a huge impact on history, and they're also difficult to predict. You know, a lot of us academics after the fact say, oh yeah, we could have seen this coming. But in fact, I don't think any of us really did see it coming in advance. So one of the major challenges we face then in responding to terrorism is that a handful of very rare cases can have a disproportionate effect on setting the agenda for the phenomena more generally. And if we don't pay attention to that, we may be responding to something that's very uncommon and very rare, and we're going to be missing the mark in terms of doing our job. So black swan events that are rare but highly visible events that provoke an almost unavoidable policy response. It can have far-reaching effects and game-changing implications, but frequently doesn't follow what you're going to run into in your day-to-day jobs. But I also want to highlight a second characteristic of terrorism. It tends to be what I call bursty. And what we mean by this is shown by this picture of a freeway traffic. That the more we get into looking at how various kinds of social phenomena exist, we find that quite a few of them are bursty. In other words, they're distributions that are highly concentrated in time and space. They're not randomly distributed. So with freeways, for example, sometimes you can get in a situation where you build an extra line and it doesn't, an extra lane, it doesn't do any good in terms of traffic because traffic tends to be bursty. It turns out that email messages are also bursty, and a whole variety of things that you wouldn't even think about. Like forest fires tend to be bursty. You get none and you get a lot of them all at once. And it turns out the global distribution of terrorism and terrorism in different parts of the world also tends to be bursty. You get none of it, and then you suddenly get a whole lot of it all of a sudden. So what I want to argue in this first part of my presentation this afternoon is that these two qualities, this black swan nature and this burstiness, are among the reasons why it's very difficult for us to respond in the very best way to terrorism. In fact, why terrorism can be quite effective and difficult to counter. On the one hand, it's relatively infrequent and hard to predict, but on the other hand, when it starts to happen, there's a tendency for it to happen a lot in the same place. So I felt what I'd do is take these two general characteristics of terrorism, but instead of just talking to you sort of in essay form, I'm going to refer to the database that I just mentioned a moment ago, the Global Terrorism Database. That database where we try to collect information on every single terrorist attack in the world. We've been working on this database for about the past 12 years. And when you think about trying to collect data on terrorism, how many of you have criminology backgrounds? Quite a few. So in criminology, we get most of our information on crime, when you think about it, from three main sources. You have three main people that are typically at a crime scene. You've got police. So we have police statistics in the United States. Uniform Crime Report is the best example of police statistics. And local jurisdictions obviously have this as well. You also have victimization data. So the government pays for a huge national victimization survey where you go into neighborhoods and you have people who have been victims of a crime. And then you can also interview ex-offenders. You can ask them about their offenses and what sorts of crimes they've engaged in. Obviously, that's going to be a problem for lots of kind of crime, but we find it works out pretty well, for example, with juvenile delinquency. Well, if you take these three main ways of gathering data on crime, none of them are very good for gathering gathering data on terrorism. We don't have good police statistics on terrorism. In fact, until recently, we had a great disagreement even about exactly what it was. Even people convicted of terrorism are usually convicted of other charges, right? So they convicted instead of homicide or money laundering or some other charge. So even the government police statistics are not very good on terrorism in general. We obviously can't do very well in terms of interviewing victims because in many cases they're not even allowed to talk to us. In some cases people are victims and don't even realize they're victims. And then they're picked randomly and they don't have all that much information. And it's also obviously difficult to interview offenders. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this all the way in the back? What it says is two barbarians and a professor of barbarian studies. And the joke here is you got this professor, you know, dressed like me with a pipe, right, and a tweed jacket, with the two barbarians. And what it's talking about is how in the devil do you go out and interview active terrorists, right? We have done some work with people who used to be terrorists and now have stopped being for whatever reason. But it's pretty difficult. You certainly aren't going to get worldwide statistics in that method. So all of these methods for gathering data on terrorism do not work very well. And for all these reasons, traditional sources haven't been very useful. But we do have one big advantage in terms of gathering information on terrorists that we don't have for ordinary crime. And that's because terrorists, unlike most common criminals, actively seek media attention. Many terrorist attacks are considered unsuccessful, in fact, if they don't get media attention. In fact, terrorist attacks are often carefully choreographed to attract the attention of the electronic media and the international press. So back in 1968, there was a couple of inventions that really brought this to the fore. The two inventions were satellite technology and handheld cameras. For the first time in human history, it was possible for an attack to happen somewhere in the world and be broadcast anywhere else in the world in almost real time. And in fact, terrorists did not lose sight of that fact. Right at the very beginning of this new technology, in 1968, July 22nd, 3 armed members of the Front for the Liberation of Palestine hijacked an El Al commercial flight scheduled to fly from Rome to Tel Aviv. The hijackers diverted the plane 48 occupants to Algeria. They released some passengers, but they held 5 Israeli passengers and 7 crew members as hostage. They were demanding the release of Palestinian guerrillas to be held in Israeli prisons in exchange for these hostages. The resulting negotiations were broadcast around the world. And in many ways, this event made it possible for the first time to invent databases on terrorism like the ones we talk about today, the Global Terrorism Database. The fact that terrorists are specifically seeking attention through the media means that it's a lot easier to study them through media reports than it is to study other sorts of more common crimes like burglary or fraud. In fact, I'd say these days it's getting hard to imagine that any serious suicide bombing or aerial hijacking or a political assassination can actually stay out of the international media. It's gotten that dramatic. So our database started in 1970, right after this technology developed. And here's what the original database looked like. I don't know if you can see this in the back. It's very low tech, essentially a bunch of cards in boxes. We would code these cards into a computer program. We relied especially on wire services in those days, Reuters in particular. We always tried to keep as many language specialists as possible around. So we probably worked in many different languages, but it was a pretty low-tech operation. And over time, it actually changed quite dramatically. So today, the way we produce this database is we go through about 2 billion stories a day in 72 different languages. And obviously, we don't have enough staff to go through 2 million stories, so we've developed computer algorithms that sort through these thousands and thousands of stories to find the ones that are most likely to be bona fide terrorism cases. We actually go through about 3 different steps, and I won't bore you entirely with the details, but just very briefly, first we use what's called Boolean filters to determine which words in the story are most likely to produce a real terrorist attack. And this is actually quite interesting. Like the word bomb is one of the best ones. But terror is not a very good one. Because too often you'll have, UTEP terrorizes, Austin, or some sports team terrorizes another.
So it turns out the word terror is not a very good word for finding a terrorist incident, believe it or not. Anyway, we use that to get these sources down to around 50,000 a week. We then use natural language processing to get rid of duplicates. And in this world, believe it or not, one of the huge headaches are duplicates. If you see this graph at the bottom of the page, anybody guess what's going on around May 1st, 2013 that causes the spike in news stories about terrorism? Anybody have a hunch? Shout it out if you have a guess. Boston Marathon. There's probably 25,000 stories about the Boston Marathon bombings. There'll be, 25,000 about the Paris attacks and you name it. And so we don't have the bandwidth to cover all those stories. And what happens if those stories disagree? So we've had to develop this fairly complicated system for saying we're going to believe the New York Times more than this newspaper, more than a local newspaper in Iowa. And we also have to get rid of stories that are duplicates, which is another part of the group called the deduplication. So essentially we run through all these filters and processes, and then we give the results to a team of about 25 individuals who actually do the coding. We code about 120 different variables. So as practitioners, I think we find some of these variables interesting. We get information on where the attack happened, who was responsible, how many people were killed, fairly detailed information on the weapon, the tactics, the victims, etc., etc. So when an incident happens, we can pretty rapidly give a whole bunch of background information about it. And I know since you all are practitioners for the most part, where this has been useful is, I take during the Boston Marathon bombing, we supplied all kinds of information. We knew how many pressure cooker bombs had existed, how many Chechen attacks, how many sports events had been attacked, and a marathon had been attacked. Because when you're a law enforcement officer on the line, the last thing you have time to do is be digging into data about the nature of the attack. So by providing that kind of objective background information, we can be very useful to you in terms of just saving you, but at the same time allowing you to make objective statements about what's going on. So I want to end with this, when we finish the talk, to give you some tools if you're interested in trying to develop more of an understanding of using that data. So we gathered all of these data, and what I want to do, I'm calling the next part of the next presentation myths. I want to say, if you put your stereotypes on one hand, we have a very smart, highly educated group of practitioners here. So you're not like a typical audience on delivering this to in many ways. But the point of this is to show what do you get when you look at 160,000 terrorist attacks from around the world over 50 years, as opposed to our stereotypes about which terrorist attacks are most important, and how do those two stack up? And I'm calling these myths in the everyday sense of they're misconceptions, basically, based on not based on actual data. So I'm going to go through 8 of them, and then we'll talk a little bit about the bursting characteristic as well. So number one, terrorist attacks were rapidly increasing in the years leading up to 9/11. I think the general public really strongly believes this because they sort of see this as a trajectory that I don't think the public. There was a bit of public interest, I think, after the Oklahoma City bombings. But really, I think the huge event was 9/11, which really got people's attention. So I think because of that, there's a tendency for people to think there's been this sort of monotonic increase in terrorism over time. But when we look at the data, it's actually much more complicated. I hope the folks all the way back, can you see this okay in the back? I'll try to describe it a bit, but the slide's not huge. You sort of know, can you see this okay? The slide, you at least see the rough outline? Okay. So what this slide shows is, from our database, the almost 160,000 attacks from 1970 to, in this case, to 2015. By the way, we supply now the data that Congress mandates to the State Department that they have to do a report on terrorism every year. For the last 6 years, these statistics are the State Department's report, which is just about to come out, actually. So we're almost done with 2016 data. So what we see, if you can see this, I've got 3 lines. One is total attacks. Under that we have fatal attacks, and under that we have mass casualty attacks, which are attacks that claim more than 10 lives. And what you see basically is attacks start to rise in the 1970s and 1980s, and they reach a peak in about 1991, and then they fall off pretty sharply. Anybody have a guess what happened in 1991 where terrorism might have declined? I'll say it's a guess, because I don't think anybody knows for sure, but I have a strong hunch. Any of you have a hunch? What would you say? What do you think? Gulf War? I couldn't hear it. Gulf War? Gulf War, that's a reasonable guess, but I think there's something even more obvious. My guess is it's the end of the Soviet Union. Because a lot of the action in the 70s and 80s were Marxist, Leninist, communist organizations. And without that support, there was a big lull. And this also points out something very important about terrorism. It has this kind of wave-like nature. This is related to burstiness. So you get this whole wave. It doesn't go on forever. We eventually figure out what to do about it. But it goes on for a while. It has a wave-like structure. Then there's a kind of trough, actually, right around 9/11. Interestingly, 9/11 was a kind of low point in terms of world terrorism. And then you get this really rapid increase that some people would call religiously motivated terrorism, which starts in about 2004 and includes, well-known characters like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And you see there actually has been a pretty sharp decline in total terrorist attacks in the database in 2015. And in 2016, we will be reporting another decline, both in total attacks and total fatalities. And you can see that there's a strong correlation between attacks and fatal attacks, but they're getting more fatal over time. We'll talk about this in just a minute in more detail, but attacks tend to cause more casualties now than they did back in the 1970s. So you can say that essentially it's more complicated than I think a lot of the public would think, and the stereotypes would think. And it's especially different in the United States. This is from our database on terrorist attacks in the United States from 1970 to 2014. And I think when I present this to the general public, they're really surprised. Because as you know, the public is very concerned about terrorism right now. They rank it as one of the leading problems facing the country. And yet, the 1970s were really a disaster in terms of terrorism. Why is that? Because you had radical student groups, you had Puerto Rican separatists, you had various kinds of African American groups, a whole variety of terrorist attacks taking place. And there's been a pretty serious decline since then. And we'll talk about another thing that's going on. Part of the reason for this decline is, I think, a good thing. We've gotten better at foiling plots. I'll have some data on that in just a second as well. Okay, myth number 2. I think there's a tendency to think that terrorist attacks reach every corner of the world. My mom is 93, and as Vic mentioned, I'm doing some work actually in Paris in a few weeks. My mom said, you can't go to Paris. There's terrorist attacks there, right? So essentially, you have this idea that there's no place safe, right? That terrorism is all over the place. And you get one attack somewhere, and which is ironic given that I live like 7 miles from the White House. So, but we get this sense that it's kind of omnipresent, right? That it's all over the place. But in fact, I think if you look at almost any kind of information about terrorism, you've seen that it's actually really quite concentrated at any given point in time. For example, we can do heat maps with our database. This is a heat map of the whole world. I'm afraid the folks way in the back may not be able to see this very well. If you can see this, though, you see it's the whole globe. And what you see is essentially the darker red spots are where the most action is. And as you'd expect, you can see Pakistan, lots of action, Afghanistan, lots of action, the Philippines. In sub-Saharan Africa, you can almost trace the desert, basically. Like there's a whole line, the Al-Shabaabs and the Boko Harams, right across the desert space. You can see there's a little bit of light in the northern part of South America, so you're picking up Colombia, to some extent Peru. And not much action, you can't, I don't think you can see well enough that Sri Lanka is completely covered. But it's not all over the world, basically. And this is 2013. Another thing that's important is terrorism moves. People forget about the fact that in the 1970s, the terrorist hotspots were Western Europe. There were groups like the IRA, the ETA, the Red Brigades. In the 1980s, most of the action was in Latin America. You had the FMLN, the FARC, the Shining Path, etc. It's only been pretty recently where the action has shifted to the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. But it's quite concentrated And we find that it's concentrated at just about every level. So I just brought with me a heat map from India. And you can see India has got a whole lot of action given by Bangladesh on the right-hand side of the country. But you could travel through most of India for a long time and never come close to a terrorist attack. And we find this is true at almost any kind of geographical space you want to look at. Terrorism is highly concentrated at the region, at the country, and even within the country it tends to be highly concentrated. Okay, I think also because of the incredible impact, I wanted to say one other thing about this. One of the offshoots of this concentration is that relatively few countries are heavy hitters with regard to total worldwide terrorism. So, for example, if you look at, I've got these countries ranked by percent of all attacks and then cumulative percent of all countries. So if you go down to the first five, take Afghanistan, so you got Afghanistan, Colombia, India, Pakistan, and Iraq. You've already got 37% of all of the 160,000 attacks on the planet. But they're only about 2.4% of all countries. So 2.4%, 37% of attacks. And if you go down to number 10, you've now got 54% of all attacks happening in less than 5% of all countries. So you have this, in a way, this real conundrum that lots of countries, most countries in the world, have not had a single attack this past year, but a small number of them have had a lot, which also plays into this burstiness business that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. Okay, another thing that we hear a lot, because we live in the United States and we are, certainly a very tightly linked communication society. The idea that the U.S. is more frequently targeted by terrorism than any other country in the world. And I think also this goes back to the black swan effect of 9/11, because this was such a devastating effect. It probably is one of the most publicized events in human history. But when we take a look at the GTD, the Global Terrorism Database, and look at the frequency of attacks and the number of fatalities, we find that in fact the U.S. comes out at number 15 among countries of the world in terms of total attacks from 1970 to 2014, and it doesn't make it into the top 20 in terms of total fatalities. In fact, our total attacks put us pretty similar to Canada or Greece. And I think the public really does not get that as well. I think the public thinks the number of attacks in the U.S. is far higher.
Sir, can I ask you a question?
Please. Yeah.
You had said earlier right now that 2015 and now 2016 terrorist attacks were down.
Right.
What is the actual definition of a terrorist attack?
Well, we could spend the rest of the afternoon on that. Okay. But let me give you a little bit.
The reason why I'm asking is because, I mean, if you were to have some of the acts that happened, like with this police officers, like in Dallas, or are those considered terrorist attacks because there was an ideology behind it?
We have let me give you the quick explanation, and we could, if we have time to do that, we can actually go into more detail, because we obviously get this a lot. We basically require, the short answer is we require the act to be political, we require it to be violence or the threat of violence, and we require that it be done by a non-state actor. So in other words, if Iran commits a terrorist act, we don't include it. It has to be a non-state actor. Now, there are some other qualifications of that, but like the incidents you're talking about, it must fit, because we have a very difficult time distinguishing hate crime from terrorism. We have to have a political motive. In fact, we're going through this right now in a couple cases. In fact, there was this stabbing at the University of Maryland very recently, which I think is going to be, we will count as terrorism because it looked like a political message. So if someone attacks a police, by the way, police officers, one of the things you'll often look at with these data is how frequently police officers get attacked. And they get attacked a lot. I'm not sure I have a slide showing it, but police are one of the main targets of terrorism. Lots of police lose their lives in terrorism. So the division would be if somebody's out there and attacks a police officer and makes a political statement about it, then we would include it, basically. So some of those attacks you're talking about would be included. And we include, like, for example, the Dylan Roof case, where the guy had a whole, diatribe about race, et cetera, we would include as well. But then if you remember the shooting at Virginia Tech some years ago, we could find no political message. The guy was just, shooting people, basically. And so that's sort of the dividing line, basically.
And the definition is determined like from the federal government, because remember, well, 2 or 3 years ago, when they wouldn't include the Mexican cartel as a terrorist group.
Right.
And they were debating whether
there are. We are a university research house, not the government. So we have our own definition. And it's interesting, I mean, even though we supply data to the State Department, so far they haven't bought that. But to tell you the truth, there's an accident for the definition, which is this database started being collected originally back in 1970 by an organization called the Secret and Global Intelligence Service. Some of you may know they used to run stagecoaches in the American West. They're a Scottish detective agency. And they used to collect data on terrorism. They would hire ex-military folks. They hire Air Force, mostly Air Force intelligence officers to collect the data. So somebody's collecting intelligence data in the Air Force, they retire and they go to work with Pinkerton, collecting the same data, but in the unclassified world. So these guys use the U.S. military definition, which is basically violence or the threat of violence for a political purpose by a non-state actor. So we inherited that definition and have kept it ever since. We've tweaked it a bit. But, and this goes back to the science bit that I started with. I'm thinking, is it hard to measure terrorism? Yes. But in principle, it's hard to measure homicide, it's hard to measure suicide, it's hard to measure lots of things we're interested in. So we've set out to try to come up with a set of rules for doing it, make the rules transparent, and put them out there. And I'm going to end the presentation with a link to our website. We have, as you can imagine, a very detailed set of definitions for how we do the cases that we find interesting. In fact, right now, today, my staff is having what they call code book camp. So every 6 months or so, the staff gets together and they say, well, what do we do with this case? What do we do with this case? And hate crime is one of the ones that give us fits. And actually, even worse than that is when you're in a place right now like Syria or Libya where there's so much violence, and oftentimes it's not being reported in full, that's a real challenge as well, obviously. Thanks for the question, though. Okay, so let me move on to, I wanted to show you this as well. Part of the reason why the U.S. rates are going down so dramatically in recent years is another phenomenon that you all, I'm sure, are well aware of, and that is we've been foiling a lot more plots before they've actually gone kinetic, before anybody's actually done anything. They're only plotting. And our database, again, because we use the military definition, does not include plots. It includes unsuccessful attacks, but not plots. So in other words, if somebody is building a suicide vest and they blow themselves up, we don't get it. If they build a suicide vest, walk out their door and blow themselves up, we get it. And again, that's the military used that definition back in 1970, and we maintained it. But it's become such a big issue that in our book, we actually went out and collected a separate database on foiled plots. And as many of you know, do we have anybody from the FBI here today? Yes. So as this gentleman is well aware, the FBI's procedures on going after terrorists changed dramatically after 9/11. So they became far more proactive. So lots of people being now charged with terrorism in the United States have not done any kinetic action. I love this military term. They haven't actually taken specific action. They've only been plotting. And this is a big chunk of what's going on. Not just in the United States, but also this is an important problem in Western Europe. Okay, 4. Most terrorist attacks involve disgruntled groups of individuals from one country carrying out attacks on civilians in other countries. Again, I think the tremendous impact of 9/11 encourages us to think about terrorism as being mostly about unhappy people from one place traveling to another place and attacking innocent civilians. And we were very interested in this question because the Global Terrorism Database is the first database that actually collected information, not just on international terrorism, which several other databases used to do, but on domestic attacks. So we didn't have a good idea until pretty recently what terrorist groups were actually doing in terms of attacking. In other words, how often were there attacks international, how often were they domestic? And with the GPD, we can actually look at that. And I just brought one example from the book that we wrote. We showed the 53 foreign terrorist organizations identified by the U.S. State Department as those that are bad actors, those that are especially interested in doing harm to the United States. And then we looked at what they actually did. And actually, I think we were all very surprised by these results. In red, you see the total number of people killed. And these are heavy hitters. They killed 38,000 to almost 42,000 people from 1970 to the present. And then we looked at the total number of attacks. So just so you understand what we're saying. So a couple of these terrorist organizations are in Pakistan, for example. So we're saying you have a terrorist organization in Pakistan. How often do they actually attack the United States versus how often do they attack a target in Pakistan? And what the data shows is they overwhelmingly attack in Pakistan or in their country of origin. We found 97% of these attacks by these 53 FTOs were actually domestic attacks, which I was actually, nobody had the data to look at this before, but it's actually quite amazing. It's not quite the same with regard to fatalities, but 90% of the fatalities of these groups were domestic fatalities. So one of the ironies of getting better counterterrorism policy is you're going to be saving people from the countries with the most terrorism, basically, because they're the most likely to be victims and most likely to be attacked. And there's all sorts of explanations. We go out, I don't have time to go into great detail, we go into in the book much more. But the biggest explanation is terrorism is used by people that don't have a lot of resources. If they have a lot of resources, they'd be military. So it's much more difficult to mount an attack against somebody in another country than it is to blow up something in your own country. I think that's the big part of what's going on. But again, I think the public tends to have a real misconception of this. We also, I think, because of 9/11 and the huge impact that 9/11 had on our thinking about terrorism, we have the idea that terrorism is like irrational. I mean, Al-Qaeda is so irrational. It's hard to get your head around it, or ISIS for that matter. But when you look at so many of the attacks in our database, you find that oftentimes they're pretty rational in the sense that they're often about groups who want territory. They want to control their own territory. They want their own country, or they want their own piece of somebody else's country. And I just brought with me to demonstrate this very rapidly the top 20 terrorist organizations in the world from 1970 to 2013. Shining Path comes out. They were very active. Sendero Luminoso. They were trying to find territory, right? They were trying to get their own country. The FMLN, likewise, trying to get its own country. Taliban is trying to take over a country. The IRA wanted its own territory. I mean, you just look through the list, and a lot of these groups, I'm not saying that this obviously justifies what they're doing, but it does make them, it makes it easier to understand them in a sense. That they're oftentimes trying to use terrorism as a tactic because they're too weak to use a military tactic. They're trying to use terrorism as a tactic to get what they want. Most terrorist attacks are incredibly lethal. And this, I think, also we get probably from a whole variety of things, especially from the media. Again, because of the high lethality of the ones we know about, the 9/11 attacks and some of the other attacks, it's easy to think that most terrorist attacks are incredibly lethal. When we look at the 160,000 attacks in the database, though, here's what we show. About 55% of them had no fatalities. And sometimes I present this to a general audience and I'll say, how can that be? It's terrorism. How can there be no fatalities? Well, sometimes you've got groups like Elephant Alf that are attacking, like, a Hummer dealership, or they're attacking a research laboratory. So they're not trying to kill people, basically. Back in the good old days, back in the days, it seems quaint now, but the IRA and the ETA and whatever days, they actually used to warn people, right, when they're going to blow things up so they would keep casualties down. And then, of course, a lot of times, terrorists are planning to kill people, but they fail. A lot of attacks fail. They try to kill as many people as possible, but they just don't succeed in doing it. So when you put all that together, a lot of these attacks do not take human lives. About 20% kill 1 or 2 people, about 11% 2 to 4. So if you go all the way out to the sort of mass casualty attacks, where there are more than 25 people, you're down to about 1.2% of all attacks that kill more than 25 people. Now, this is exactly great news when you're talking about a database with 160,000 attacks, but it does suggest to you that a lot of times run-of-the-mill cases are not likely to produce lots of fatalities. Okay, most terrorist attacks rely on sophisticated weaponry. And again, if the black swan is 9/11, you've got long-term planning, split-second timing, a very innovative use of existing resources. And you know, if you think 9/11 was sophisticated, it pales into insignificance compared to the diabolical sophistication of the enemies of Claire Danes, Kiefer Sutherland, Bruce Willis, and the other Hollywood stories about terrorism. And these guys are really sophisticated. And there's this sort of super terrorist using incredible weaponry, using all kinds of resources and so on. But contrary to the view of the sort of super terrorists, when you look at the weapons used in terrorism, they're surprisingly familiar. So about 49, almost 50% of all of the attacks in our database involve explosives or bombs. And oftentimes, about as exotic as this gets is C4. And most of these are readily available, things like dynamite. Another 34% are firearms. Now, of course, if you don't think these things can be incredibly lethal, and we can provide plenty of examples, like certainly the Orlando case recently showed you can be pretty damn lethal with ordinary firearms. But the point is, they're not the super sophisticated weaponry. Again, if you had that kind of sophistication, you'd have a military, and you'd be fighting a kind of military battle. Incendiaries, you be things like Molotov cocktails, which are pretty common. Melee is where you've got just a crowd armed with all sorts of things that charge the area. And then another, which is less than 0.5%, is everything else. So that's the chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, all of that stuff, the sophisticated stuff that often gets in the Hollywood film, is really very, very rare, thankfully. Finally, most terrorist organizations are long-lasting and difficult to eradicate. Again, when we look at the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda and the Irish Republican armies and the Tamil Tigers, I think we have a perception that terrorist organizations are really very difficult to eradicate. Well, in the database, we identify about 2,400 terrorist organizations that have committed at least one attack from 1970 to the present. And here's their length of time. About 65% of them are gone within the first year. Another 5% are gone in 2 years. And you don't get out to the heavy hitters, the groups that have been around for more than 10 years, is way out here. And it's about something like 10% of total groups. So it isn't that easy. In a way, terrorist organizations are like business startups. Most of them fail in the first year they're in business. So we ask ourselves, why do people have the impression that terrorist groups are long-lasting and difficult to eradicate? And I got to tell you, at our last holiday party, my staff came up with this game where they took the 2,500 terrorist organizations in our database, put them on slips of paper, and then they put 2,500 rock and roll groups in the thing. You had to pick a name and guess whether it was a rock and roll group or a terrorist organization. You'd be surprised how often our experts missed it. Because, we all know Al-Qaeda and the IRA and the ETA and the Chinese past, but how many of you have ever heard of the anti-capitalist brigades or the revolutionary flames, or one of my favorites, the angry farmers? And these are all also groups in the database, but they're one-hit wonders. They had one attack and then they disappeared into history. So again, we have a stereotype based on this group of heavy hitters that have been very difficult to get rid of it. And one of the things we've been very interested in from a research standpoint, how can you get more groups to follow the life cycle of the angry farmers as opposed to the Al-Qaeda? What levers can you pull to make a terrorist organization less likely to be around in the long haul, less likely to last more than a year? But from a law enforcement standpoint, too, it's important to know that the terrorists make all kinds of mistakes. They screw up in all kinds of ways. It's a bit of a myth, I think, the idea that they're these sort of super actors that are always on top of everything. Okay, I think I mentioned you. Am I running a little bit out of time? Am I okay? No, okay, good. Well, I want to, so essentially, in terms of these myths, what I'm trying to do here is essentially say, if we treat this as a science, if we gather the best data we can gather on it, we look at it objectively, these are the characteristics we're finding. And hopefully some of that at least will be useful for people that are on the front line, as you all are, in terms of dealing with this problem. So we know that attacks are declining just before 9/11. We know that very few attacks involve disgruntled groups from one country attacking another. We know that the groups tend to disappear pretty rapidly in many cases. But as I mentioned in the introduction, terrorism also tends to be bursty. That is, when it starts to happen, you tend to get a lot of it rapidly. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but I just want to give you some examples that we collected from the database and from other work we've been doing. One of these is from the United States. I don't know, again, I hope you can see this all the way in the back, but what it shows, these are attacks against the United States in 1970 up through the present time. And if you can see it, you'll see that there's sort of three main lines here. There's a blue line here, there's a kind of a green line here, and there's a red line at the end. And what we did with this analysis, I'm not going to go into all the statistical stuff, but it essentially shows that if you look at the terrorism problem against the United States for the past half century, we haven't faced one adversary, we faced three clusters of adversaries. Three groups that kind of came and went. One group that started very active in the 1970s, it's pretty much gone by the 1980s. Most of these groups this includes like Puerto Rican separatists, a lot of left-wing organizations. Then we've got a big group that's green on the chart that runs during the 1990s and ends before 9/11. And this would be a lot of right-wing groups fit into this organization or into this cluster. And then finally, you've got at the very end the red line. And the red line is picking up particularly Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their affiliates, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and so on. So you don't have one problem, you got three. But notice that it's bursty, right? That you get a series of attacks, they reach a peak, eventually we figure out how to deal with them, and then they disappear, and then you're on to the next problem. And that tends to be, we see this with our data in a bunch of different ways. It has this kind of wave-like, bursty characteristic to it. It's the same, this is not for the United States, this is for the whole world. This is showing, again, trying to put countries into patterns of attacks. And the red line, in some ways, is the most interesting here. It's only about 10% of all countries in the world, but as you can see, it's responsible for a huge number of attacks. So the red line, I think, in this case, I've got it somewhere. It includes Colombia, Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland, India, Israel, Pakistan, France, and Spain, and Turkey. So no surprises there. Notice also there's a blue line here, which was pretty low until pretty recently, and then shoots up at the end. And that includes especially Iraq and Afghanistan. So again, though, we've just been doing this work on sub-Saharan Africa, and there was no terrorism in sub-Saharan Africa. Almost no terrorism until about 2003, and then boom, you get huge amounts of action going on. In fact, one of the few optimistic things I can say about studying terrorism for the last 20 years is it moves, right? So if you're going to predict where terrorism will be in 20 years, my guess, based on the past half century, is it won't be in the Middle East and Africa. Because I think at the end of the day, people don't like to live in incredibly disorganized, violent situations, and eventually we come up with ways of dealing with it, and we move on. At least that's my hope. So just a couple of other examples of burstiness. This tracks all known aerial hijackings in the world from 1948 to the present. And you can see this huge spike in about 69. Again, bursty, right? It's off the charts. And what do you think, what did we do to get rid of much of aerial hijacking instead? Sorry. I think this was a policy thing that actually worked very well. Anybody have a guess? Happened, as you can see in this table, it happened about 72. Metal detectors. I think metal detectors were extremely effective unless you get people willing to kill themselves on the plane. When metal detectors started being put in place around the world, huge drop-off in hijacking. So normally, we eventually figure things out and we come up with ways of dealing with the threat. But still, when it happens, you get a lot of it. Right now, suicide bombings. We just had this Kabul case, a truck bomb. Right now, ISIS, we were just looking at this, 51% of ISIS attacks are either suicide bombings or truck or vehicle bombings. So it's become a huge weapon for them. And it's pretty damn effective, and so far we have not figured out very effective ways of dealing with suicide. But again, notice this person, there were no suicide attacks back in the 70s, 80s, 90s until pretty recently. You get something that works, you get a lot of it rapidly until you figure out what to do with it. Same with improvised explosive devices. You have none, and then suddenly you have this huge spike in improvised explosive devices. So, anyway, going back to where we started, we've got this black swan characteristic of terrorism. The notion that we sometimes pay too much attention to cases that are pretty unusual. So if you're going in with a mindset about doing your job and thinking about 9/11, what do you do when you run into the Dylan Roots and the Omar Matins and many of the other kind of cases which do not fit that model at all? On the other hand, what can keep you up nights is when you start to get attacks, if they're successful, you may get a lot of them in pretty rapid succession. So I'm arguing that policies on terrorism are strongly affected by black swan events, and 9/11 is a good example of that. But then in addition, terrorism has its burst equality. And this last point underscores the importance of taking new threats as seriously as you can as they are posted. Because, once you start to get something like suicide, terrorism, IEDs, it can be devastating. And in fact, in regard to this, one of the early attacks, the first adopters of new technologies, can be harbingers of things to come. I don't know, any of you in here are movie junkies. I sort of like movies, but any of you remember the old Hitchcock movie, The Birds? Yeah, remember The Birds? Classic Hitchcock movie. And I love this analogy. There's this great scene where a single bird lands on the jungle gym equipment behind Melanie Daniels, who's the rich socialite that was played by Tippi Hedren. On February 16, 1993, a truck bomb in the basement parking garage of the World Trade Center killed 6 people, injured hundreds, and destroyed $500 million worth of property. And when we look back at that event now, which is now almost 30 years ago, or 2 decades anyway, we can now see that it was a harbinger of things to come, that this group would morph into a worldwide movement that would mount a series of deadly attacks around the world and the globe, which in the Hitchcock movie leads to chaos, right? But just look at how it has evolved. This is total top 20 perpetrator organizations from the GTE for 2014. You can see the fatalities listed there, like 9,300 from the Islamic State, 4,000 from the Taliban as well. The top 4, though, are all directly connected to this movement, to ISIS and to Al-Qaeda. So, with enough ammunition to destroy just 2 buildings, attackers focusing on the World Trade Center power has the potential to take as many lives as all of the losses Americans experienced in 10 years of the Vietnamese War. You have about 50,000 people in each of those towers. You combine this fact with the increasing ability of technology to give smaller and smaller organizations access to increasingly deadly weapons. And our staff, one of our divisions deals with new weapon technology. And oh my God, if you want to be nervous at night, you should talk to those folks. Drones, some of the implications of drones are going to be phenomenally dangerous. Or the fact that you can now get DNA and biological labs that are portable, that can do all sorts of things that you used to have a huge facility to do with access to much more easily. So you put the development technology together with the facts that we've got these sorts of techniques and these ideologies out there, and it is worrisome. So 9/11 fortunately turned out to be a rare event of black swan, but unfortunately the threat of more deadly terrorist attacks, I think, is likely to be a more like permanent feature of the 20th century.